What is the Kurdish question? For more than a century, the ethnic minority belonging to a large area in West Asia have fought to retain their identity, their culture, their language, their autonomy, often against dismissive or hostile nation states. Once a self-governing region under the banner of the Ottoman Empire, the Kurds were divided by Allied powers after World War I, when that empire fell. What resulted was the separation of the Kurds into four groups now living under new countries: Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Since then, nationalist groups have emerged in all four countries, some campaigning for autonomy, others for complete separation and a restoration of a Greater Kurdistan. But did this idea of a unified Kurdistan ever exist? Dr. Zeynep Kaya is a lecturer in international relations at the University of Sheffield and a co-convener of the Kurdish Studies series with the LSE Middle East Center. I sat down with her to talk about the plight of Kurdish people today and if this fight for self-determination still rings true. Dr. Zeynep Kaya, welcome to the Big Picture. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
I want to start by asking you a very big question and a very vague question, but I think it's a good starting point for this conversation. And that question is, what is the Kurdish question?
Yeah, it is a very big question. So it depends on what you're interested in. So if you're looking at it from a human rights perspective, Kurdish question is the violation of the rights of a group of people because of their ethnicity, because of the language they speak, because of their identity, and the denial of their rights and the abuse of their certain rights. If you look at it from a political perspective, then Kurdish question is related to the political goals of the different Kurdish political parties throughout the history. There are many throughout the history. There are many Kurdish political parties and organizations. They all have different types of political goals, and some of these goals are even in contradiction with each other. So each organization would define their Kurdish question in a particular way based on their political goals, whether they are based in Turkey or in Syria or in Iraq, or they might have a more kind of regional goal. And in a bigger, if you take it from a more kind of big picture perspective, then Kurdish question is more about the rights of a group of people, a community, a minority group, and their desire to have a statehood or some sort of control about their political future, and their inability throughout the history not to achieve that, whatever that goal is. So the Kurdish struggle for statehood, Kurdish struggle for autonomy, for more rights have been there for a very, very long time. You know, you can trace it back to late 19th century during the Ottoman Empire, and then you see the demands for Kurdish self-determination and statehood becoming very much to the fore at the end of the World War I, and this being discussed in international conferences. And then this transformed into, transformed into different formats in each country after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, in Turkey, in Iran, in Iraq, in Syria, and started to take different forms because of the different political, cultural structures of each state. And they lived in those states for more than 100 years. So they also transformed in those processes, in those contexts, in different ways. So basically, from a bigger picture, Kurdish question is about the future of Kurdish people, their political future, and the uncertainties around that, and the struggle that they have been carrying out for a very long time, and that uncertain future ahead of them. So, yeah, several answers to that question, basically.
It's a very simple answer to the question.
I'm sure.
So, when you look at these four geographical locations where the vast majority of Kurdish people live, Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Iraq, what unifies these people? What is similar about them in that you could classify them as a united ethnic group, at least on paper?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'm not an anthropologist. I'm not a sociologist either. So my answer would be very political science answer. But if you look at the claims about their identity, so I'm not in a place to answer who Kurds are. They are in the right place to answer who they are and what their identity is. But in general, outsiders and Kurds themselves have defined their group as an identity with shared linguistic characteristics. Although Kurdish language has a lot of different dialects, Kurmanji, Sorani, so on and so forth, and sometimes outsiders look at Kurmanji and Sorani and consider them almost as different languages, because someone speaking Kurmanji may not be able to understand someone speaking Sorani. So Sorani is being spoken mainly in the southern area, southern Kurdistan, in Iraqi Kurdistan, whereas Kurmanji being more dominant in the Turkish region. Sorani also in Iran. So and then in terms of other characteristics, so they identify themselves as a different ethnic group that has been there in the region even before Turkish tribes and Turkish groups arrived centuries ago. So they consider themselves as the ancient inhabitants of this region. And therefore they would consider themselves as a more original owners of that geography. One of the things that identifies Kurds is about what's different about them vis-a-vis other identities in the Middle East.
The fact that they're not Arab.
Yeah, they're not Arab. They are not Persian. They are not Turkish. They don't speak none of those languages. So that's one of the identifiers. Geographically, the original Kurdish habitation has been in the area around Zagros Mountains. So this is a mountain range from Iran to Kurdistan. And then a little bit also the areas in East Turkey, further southeast Turkey. But of course, this geography is a mixed geography, so that you find Arabs and Turks, Assyrians, Armenians, Christians, all sorts of groups in that region as well. But particularly that heartland is more dominantly dominated by the Kurdish groups.
There exists a kind of tension in all four of these countries between some of the Kurdish people that live there and the states that govern. And it manifests itself differently in different countries, but essentially it comes down to this idea of whether or not Kurdish people belong together in their own separate state or multiple states. Where does this tension stem from? Is this a post-World War I thing? Did it exist before that?
I mean, we can trace that tension between Kurds and their rulers throughout the history, centuries, for centuries, going back to the history, basically. So when you look at the Ottoman history and the rivalry between Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire, the Iranian Empire, and these are the two big empires, and their borders basically united or met in that area where Kurds are located, and also going to the north and the south. In that long historical period, the Kurdish tribal leaders have really used this being in between positions. So some of them allied themselves with the Ottoman port in Istanbul, some of them with the Safavid Empire, and also some of them were kind of changing alliances on a constant basis. So, and this area is not very penetrable geographically. So these Kurdish tribal rulers have been there and have been almost like local suzerains of these regions, sometimes, mostly allying themselves with one of the empires. And there was tension in terms of particularly with the centralization of the political system in Ottoman Empire in the 18th century and 19th century, early 19th century, when the Sultan wanted to, or the administration in Istanbul wanted to increase their direct control. So they didn't want to work through suzerains anymore to collect taxes, so on and so forth. And the Kurdish tribes in that period revolted against Istanbul. And we see several big revolts. There are many, but some of the big ones are the Bedirhan revolt. So this is from the 1800s until the end of it, even like late 1700s. So that was one of the tensions, and most of the tension was about losing control and gaining control in that sense. So the tension wasn't necessarily based on identity. For instance, Ottoman Empire was a very multicultural, multi-ethnic political system. And you would see people from all different backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds in the Ottoman administration. So it was more about losing control and territorial control. And also rivalries between the different tribes. So suddenly, if the Ottoman Empire decides to ally themselves with another tribe, the other tribe wouldn't be happy, tribal leader wouldn't be happy about that. So there's also rivalry among the Kurdish tribes in that period. But when we move the world, as the world changed, as we transitioned from the imperial system to more kind of nation-state system, but also with the increasing dissemination of nationalism, self-determination as political ideas, we see the emergence of Kurdish nationalist groups in more explicit terms in this period, particularly in Istanbul, in the more kind of in the big cities, and these are mainly affiliated with Kurdish tribes. Members of Kurdish tribes who are more affluent, so they were able to get education in Istanbul. They spoke languages. Some of them were part of the Ottoman administration. They had high authority positions as well. But you see this emergence of an effort to disseminate the distinctiveness of the Kurdish identity and coalescing of a Kurdish political goal around that. So publication of Kurdish journals, efforts in raising awareness, linguistic studies, rewriting the old Kurdish poems or stories, so on and so forth. So we see this happening in the late 19th century particularly, and early 20th century. And of course this kind of started to run against the idea of the Turkish nationalism, which was also on the rise in the late Ottoman Empire.
The nation-building exercise that's happening.
So you see these two different, nation-building processes, kind of contradicting each other. And then after the establishment of the Turkish nation-state, which is quite, clearly Turkish in its national identity, even though, especially in the early years, perhaps it had more kind of civic characteristic, but still it very much emphasized the idea of being Turkish. And even though many of the Kurdish groups allied themselves with the independence movement of Mustafa Kemal in the fight against the Western countries invading Anatolia, there was an alliance between them. And I think there was also potential ideas about forming the new state as co-allies. But then in the formation of the state, many Kurdish historians would argue that Kurds were pushed aside. From 1923 until almost 1950s, until mid-1940s, several Kurdish revolts happened. But the same thing also happened in Iran. Similar things also happened in Iraq. So what happened in Iraq is a whole different process. So when the Turkish Republic was established, British became establish a mandate rule in Iraq. And this area also covered some of the areas that was demanded by the Kurds as their own territory. So the British established a Kurdish administration in Süleymaniye, which didn't last long, only 2 years, because they wanted Sheikh Mahmud wanted to declare himself as king and wanted to take over the administration and be independent, but the British didn't like that, and there was conflict between them. So that conflict happened between the British rulers and Kurds. And then after the monarchy, again, that tension continued. So we see this history of tensions between, especially escalating from the 1960s, between the Kurdish groups with the establishment of Kurdistan Democratic Party, KDP, of Barzani, and then PUK, Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, by the Talabani family, and their kind of fight, military conflict, but also political tension between the two groups. And you see a similar process in Turkey as well. So the revolts ended in Turkey perhaps in the 1940s, but then there was a quiet period, but the Kurdish groups continued to organize themselves. They also allied themselves with other leftist groups in Turkey. And the similar process is happening in Iran as well, was happening in Iran. And then with the 1970s, 1980s, the nature of things started to change as well. I think many of the Kurdish political movements in all countries became more mobilized in the grassroots as well. Their adherents, started to increase in numbers. Obviously, they benefited from the dissemination of communication tools, phones, radio, and then internet. And they were more actively organized. The diaspora is a very key factor here that increased that kind of political awareness and mobilization, the support they received from diaspora, especially those who were expelled or sought asylum because of the political oppression in Turkey, in Iraq, Syria. They went to Europe and other countries and organized themselves there. And it's a tension between the Kurds and the rulers that took different forms and continuously evolved and transformed.
Do you think the idea of the post-colonial era and all of these things that happened immediately after these borders were put in place, is that related to this idea of a Kurdish fight for independence?
Absolutely. So if you were a Kurdish person who is politically minded and who believes in the Kurdish goal to establish their own state or some form of autonomous region, and especially many of the politically active Kurds have been experiencing the ugly side of their states around oppression and exclusion and so on and so forth. So for them, there is a tendency to see the borders, the emergence of these borders and division of the area they inhabit by 4 different countries, nation state, and very in some ways authoritarian nation states who kind of emphasize one sort of identity, Persian identity, Turkish identity, Arabic identity, so on and so forth. So they feel like they have a homeland, but this homeland has been divided by 4 different states. They also claim Kurdistan, so there are many Kurdistans. They have produced lots of maps of Kurdistans as well. And interestingly, throughout the history, this happens with all nationalist movements. This geographic area of Kurdistan is constantly expanding on these maps. Right?
And this is the idea of the Greater Kurdistan.
Yes, exactly.
One of the things I find really interesting, because you've written a lot about this idea of symbolism and how symbols are created and used for nationalist movements. And this term, correct me if I get it wrong, but cartographic propaganda?
Yes, yeah.
What is that?
Yes, so it's a very common thing. So when you look at the world map, it's divided by lots of states. And we most of the time take it for granted, because, and then it becomes a natural thing that, this is where Britain is, this is where France is, this is where Myanmar is, and etc. And then these cartographic divisions and the division of the map becomes kind of a normality. And because maps are powerful tools to give that image, to give that message, and many nationalist groups who want to attain their own states also have used this tool, and quite rightly so, to say, well, this is where we belong, this is our territory. So especially in the World War I, for instance, the mapping and the cartographic politics is so dominant in the discussions, and you see that to the Versailles Congress, to the Paris Conference, and Versailles, many groups that wanted to obtain their right to self-determination because Wilson announced self-determination as an international principle. It became an international principle in that period. So this raised the hopes of many nationalist groups, from Irish in Ireland to the Kurds, to many groups in East Asia, so on and so forth. But obviously, the post-World War conversations only covered the European and Ottoman territories, and they didn't want to deal with those beyond that. And they said, League of Nations will take care of those demands, and so on and so forth.
Which she did a great job doing.
Exactly, yeah, amazing. And those groups also sent their own maps. So the Kurds did the same thing. They developed their own maps and said, but then you see alternative maps emerging within the Kurdish groups as well, saying, some Kurds saying this is where Kurdistan is. Another group of Kurdish leaders are saying, no, the boundaries are here. So it's basically another language used in these political negotiations, and maps are effective tools for doing that. And most states have used maps as cartographic propaganda. Even today, when you look at Russia and where the areas that they claim to be Russian, in Caucasia, in Crimea, in Ukraine, the same things constantly happening. So in that work, I tried to challenge the idea that cartography and territory is something natural. We construct it. And this doesn't make any territory natural or not natural. So none of the Turkish states or Iranian state or Britain or France, are these territories, natural? No, they are out of political, historical, economic processes, but also enmeshed with identity and etc. So it's a very complex situation, and it's hard to say any map is a depiction of a natural homeland. Yeah. And the same thing applies to Kurdistan. The same thing applies to any state territory.
Milletçe bir olalım, iri olalım, diri olalım, kardeş olalım diye bunları söyledik. Ve çözüm süreciyle de bu süreci taşlandıralım dedik. Ama bunlar ne yazık ki çözüm sürecini filan anlamadılar, anlamak istemediler. Öyleyse şu anda bu buzdolabındadır.
The vast majority of Kurdish people live in Turkey, from what I understand. I mean, it's about 20 million people, which is quite a crazy number to think about, given the population of Turkey, and given the fact that, that means that 1 in 4 people in Turkey, 1 in 4 Turks are of Kurdish origin or Kurdish descent. How has the Kurdish identity been seen and been treated within a specifically Turkish context?
I mean, so the numbers are tricky because none of the censuses are actually asking people if they are Kurdish or if they're Armenian or if they are this and that. So therefore, any number will be estimation. Right. You're absolutely right. Majority of Kurdish people live in Turkey, and the geographic area they are more higher in numbers proportionately compared to other groups. Is quite a wide geography in Turkey. And it's an interesting question because the Turkish state has always said, anyone who says they are Turkish. It's kind of this idea of if you learn the language of French and if you adopt the culture, you're French, no matter where you're coming from, this kind of civic idea. But then in terms of giving them linguistic rights, education in mother tongue, or publications, or singing Kurdish songs, the very kind of not community level, identity related things that we take for granted in our own cultures, and they were deprived of that, and they had to do it secretly. So the Turkish state has been quite suppressive in that sense, although some legal changes were made allowing Kurdish education, so on and so forth. It hasn't been necessarily that, it hasn't been a transformative change, basically. So in Turkey, it's a very politicized issue. So if you adhere to the political goals of a Kurdish political movement, then you're an enemy of the Turkish state, right? But in terms of culture, it's a different story. So depending on which area of Turkey you are in. So the highest number, there's always a cliche saying the highest, Istanbul is the biggest Kurdish city. And it's partly
Just
true.
by number.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And they have very much integrated into the Turkish life, Turkish society, and I would say more so than in Iran, in Iraq, and in Syria. Even though there is significant marginalization and violation of rights, but at the same time, if you say, if in your personal life you might be Kurdish, even in among your colleagues they might know you're Kurdish, you speak Kurdish, but you don't necessarily affiliate yourself with any political movement, and you just carry on your life as normal without violating any of the Turkish laws, then you can do anything. Demand for self-determination has been made by Kurdish groups in all 4 countries, including Turkey. And this has been obviously not accepted. And it's this combination of demand for self-determination, military organization, and political movement. But within Turkey, the main, I think, organization that's been very active for the last 4 decades is the PKK, Kurdish Workers' Party, established by Öcalan in the late 1970s, 1978 to be specifically, and they started their military fight against the Turkish government in 1982.
And was it an explicitly separatist movement from the beginning?
So they were established, they wanted to establish an independent Kurdish state. And that was an explicit demand for self-determination, of course. And that remained to be the case until 1999, until Öcalan, the leader of the PKK, was captured and imprisoned. And then the self-determination self-determination in the form of separatism transformed into a demand for self-determination, even though they don't use the word, for autonomy. So several concepts have been generated since then by Öcalan. So it's called democratic autonomy. So they want to seek a solution to the Kurdish issue within the territorial boundaries of the Turkish state without challenging the territorial borders, but having some form of autonomy within Turkey, or some form of self-administration, some form of recognition. So that's how it has transformed at the moment within Turkey. So there are no groups that are demanding, as far as I know, separatism. There are lots of groups. PKK is not the only political party in Turkey. There are many political parties, Kurdish political parties. But the PKK, the biggest one, is not demanding separatism anymore in their goals. Yeah.
And this is, from my understanding, at some point there was a kind of split, right, between what the PKK was and this desire, this newer desire to enter into the political arena and to have engage in the democratic system and have representatives, and that's where the HDP party comes from. And but then that has also been the source of tension and with the state and with controversy. Was there? I mean, the accusation, I suppose, from some parties is that there was never a separation between these groups, and that whatever Kurdish groups exists is really kind of a front for this persistent desire for separatism. But what do we see happening now in the political arena? There's this party that represents largely Kurdish issues. Have they really been accepted into the political system?
No. Yes and no. So just to go back to the history again. So the HDP is not the first Kurdish party that was established. So Kurds have been establishing parties since 1970s. So they were mainly very much active with the Turkish leftist groups. So the Kurdish and Turkish leftist groups were part of the Workers' Party, for instance. The split happened within the leftist movement. And the Kurds started to establish their own political parties in the late 1970s. That was a very, divisive process for Turkey, which ended up in the coup in 1980. And after that, the Kurds started to seek a separate political movement because they felt like the Turkish leftist movement is not necessarily partly aligned with their goals because of their ideological affiliation, but at the same time they wanted the specific needs and demands of Kurdish people to be recognized. So PKK is one of the outcomes of that process. And in the 1980s, with the transition to, again, back to the democratic system, after the coup regime, I think lasted about 2.5 years, and then the elections happened again. And then in the mid-1980s, we see the emergence of Kurdish parties, political parties, who ran in elections. But many parties emerged. They were closed, shut down, emerged with a new name, shut down, emerged with it's like a graveyard of names, basically, acronyms. So those political parties, so Kurdish political parties, whether they are affiliated explicitly or implicitly with PKK, or they have nothing to do with PKK, have emerged in that context, in the since 1980s, basically. So HDP is a fruit of that. Of that process.
It's the latest
It's a legacy.
iteration,
It's the current iteration of that legacy, basically.
Yeah.
So they have been in the political system. They have a long history of being part of the political system, but it has been constant struggle. So they were imprisoned. They were not allowed to run in elections. Administrative or legal cases opened against them to stop them from running. Sometimes opening an outright case against them for violating a constitutional law, for instance. Then that leads to imprisonment, which happened in the case of Selahattin Demirtas, who's the co-leader of HDP, who has been in prison for 6 years now.
Ülkede bir savaş, bir kaos hazırlığı yapıyorlar. Çünkü sandığa asla inanmadılar. Sandıktan AKP çıkarsa ancak sandığa saygıları var bunların. Hiçbir zaman milletin iradesine, halkın iradesine saygılı olmadılar. Ancak AKP sandıktan çıkıyorsa halkın iradesi değerlidir onlar için.
In 2013, this somewhat historic peace process began between the Turkish government under President Erdogan and the PKK, Abdullah Öcalan himself. And this seemed like a kind of a shift in the way that Turkish politics was dealing with the PKK, with the Kurdish issue. And for, however brief that moment was, there seemed to be a kind of agreement that this approach to Kurdish self-determination needed to change. What happened that meant that idea, that spirit of negotiation, didn't last?
That's a really good question. And I think many people will give lots of different answers to that. My take is that I think initially the government was trying to do something different for whatever reason. So maybe they wanted to expand their voter base among the Kurdish populations, or maybe they had other kind of goals around transforming the system into a more democratic one, or giving rights to different groups, especially the Kurds, who have been denied like linguistic rights, and they did change some of the legal rules around it, as I mentioned earlier. So there was an opening there, I think, and conversations in the background happened as well. So official talks began, but before the official talks, there was a long period of conversations between Öcalan and some of the PKK leaders and the Turkish politicians or the intelligence services, for instance. So those conversations have been happening for a longer period. What changed can be related to multiple things. One of them is, I think, the domestic politics and the electoral politics. The AKP's efforts were received positively by both Kurds and Turks, especially those who are more democratically minded, especially those who wanted the conflict to end. But I think it didn't reap the expected benefits for the government in the end. And it also ended up alienating some of the more Turkish nationalists or more nationalistically minded Turkish populations, voters, and political parties. in addition to that, what really sealed the deal, I think, is the unexpected rise of the HDP. They were very successful. And Selahattin Demirtas and HDP really managed to bring lots of people, with like-minded people together, whether they are Turkish or Kurdish or different groups. Their slogans and their actions appeared genuinely democratic and liberal as well for many groups. And their electoral campaigning was so they were talking about environment, they were talking about LGBT rights, about women, gender equality, and things many Turkish people in Turkey have been waiting for a very long time, because AKP, the government party, has not necessarily been given much space for these conversations, and there's an increasing authoritarianism, etc., etc. So.
And all of a sudden, they're a major political
exactly,
player.
and it changed the whole dynamic in the outcome of the elections. They suddenly became the kingmakers. So whoever's side they would go would become the government. So in that process, basically, the whole situation collapsed. So we had 2 elections in 2015, and HDP did really well, and then that election was cancelled. The negotiations were over. The military action towards in southeast Turkey began, especially in the Kurdish areas, and then we had another election in November. And then after that, the imprisonment of Kurdish MPs, etc., we experienced, and we still, that's what's happening. So I think the main reason is the political success of the Kurdish party was the main reason, which changed the whole electoral game for AKP, for the government, and they allied themselves with MHP. So with that coalition, they were able to gain majority again, and then there was no going back to any conversation about peace deal or ending the conflict.
Where then does that leave this idea of Kurdish self-determination? Is this in the complexity that you described earlier about where Kurds see themselves as Kurds, as Kurdish people, as Turkish? Is this an idea that is still alive and is still popular, or is it starting to become something that is somewhat in tension even within Kurdish communities?
I think as an idea, it mainly exists in Iraqi Kurdistan as a political goal.
Where there is a somewhat autonomous
Exactly.
region.
And they have, in 2018, run a referendum for independence. So KRG is more like a traditional political movement that prefers a trajectory of a political movement, autonomous region, and then nation state. Whereas the KDP is the main kind of, I guess, lead in that, even though PUK is a very influential power in that context as well, but KDP is kind of considering itself the main kind of leading Kurdish party movement in the Middle East that kind of represents the Kurdish nation, however you define it. And they feel like they're closest to attaining self-determination compared to Kurds in Iran, who are entirely pushed out to the margins. They're mainly active in the borderlines. Compared to Syrian Kurds, until the start of the Syrian war, nobody really heard about them, right? There was where PKK has been very involved since 1980s. PKK's main bases were in Syria, so there's a strong Kurdish PKK mobilization there, which is the PYD is the outcome of that, of course. And so when you put KDP to one side, the other kind of biggest leading political movement in the Middle East is the PKK. PKK explicitly says they are against the idea of nation state. They don't want self-determination. They want self-administration. They want localization of power. They call it, Öcalan coined it as democratic confederalism. So where you have these layers of administrations in any governance structure, from village level or a kind of neighborhood level until the party level, the regional level that encompasses all four countries, or within the country, for instance, PYD being the high level. But there is this constant communication between these layers of governance where the voices of the grassroots is being raised at the top. So it's kind of bottom-up democratic. That's the idea. What it looks like in practice is another question, of course. And PKK is known to be quite an authoritarian movement, quite an authoritarian internally. It has a very authoritarian structure. And it has been using military tools. It is listed as a terrorist organization by Turkey, but also by European countries, by the US. So they are in this difficult position. And I think they are not claiming to have a nation state, or they are not demanding it, but they are demanding something different.
My final question to you, we started off talking about what is this idea of a Kurdish question and what is the idea of Kurdish unity, whether Kurdish people need a kind of unity, a kind of self-governance across borders in order to fulfill self-governance or not. And in the context of, all of these things that are happening recently that are putting Kurdish groups on an international platform and giving them a sense of empowerment and identity, do Kurds now have this sense that they have an important role in the region and they are part of this region and they are part of the countries that they find themselves in geographically, and that is good enough, that is a satisfying outcome or a direction? Or is this question still there about, do Kurds really belong in any of these countries, or do they only belong together?
It will very much depend, I think, the way these governments are transforming, their political systems are transforming. So I think underlying the issue was inclusivity, respect for different ethnic groups and minorities, and having a genuine democratic system. So some Kurds not all Kurds adhere to PKK's ideology. Not all Kurds support Kurdish political parties. Many Kurds are quite dissatisfied with their own Kurdish parties as well. If you look at Kurdistan region, Iraq, and there are many Kurdish political parties apart from PKK, KDP, PUK, several in all these four countries. So I wouldn't say there is one united Kurdish movement that all Kurdish populations are kind of behind. There are many Kurds who also vote for Turkish parties, for instance, and they feel more affiliated with them. There are Kurds who have multiple ethnic backgrounds and they have mixed identities. No one has one pure identity. Our identity is a layered thing, and you might have multiple identities. So, therefore, in terms of what the Kurdish populations and Kurdish movements see themselves in the future, and what will satisfy them and what will not satisfy them will very much depend on how these governments are treating them. But also it will depend on how Kurdish movement itself is evolving. Kurdish political parties, especially, I guess, all of them actually have been very strategic and able to respond to the changes happening around them and then use opportunities in these contexts to gain leverage internationally, regionally, within their own groups. So Kurdish history just shows that they are a political movement and a society that can sustain itself and persevere and exist in one form or another throughout the history. And I think therefore Kurdish question will not go anywhere. It will maintain, and what's important is that I hope that the Middle East, the region, transform into a place where people can say their political wishes without fear of any pressure, and we just have dialogues and reach a consensus as people who are sharing the same territory, and decide on our future through that process rather than constantly fighting with each other. And unfortunately, the way the governments are functioning is building and feeding on polarity and divisions and differences. And Kurdish-Turkish dynamics, Arab-Kurdish dynamic is just one aspect of it. There is also like socioeconomic divisions. There are lots of other environmental issues. So so the Kurdish question will not go away, but I don't know how it will transform and what it will transform into. But the last 10 years have shown that Kurdish groups, Kurdish political parties are acting. They are political parties that needs to be reckoned with, and they have functions and abilities to navigate the complex politics really well on the ground, and use opportunities and circumstances in a way that will help them in their goals, whatever their goals are. So we'll see what will happen in the future. Yeah.
Dr. Zeynep Kaya, thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for watching this episode of The Big Picture. If you found it educational, illuminating, or even just interesting, please consider liking and sharing and letting us know about your thoughts below. Are you someone of Kurdish descent? Do you identify as being Kurdish? What did you think of this conversation and the ideas that were discussed? Please let us know. You can also listen to all of our episodes, including this one, on Spotify, on Apple and Google, or wherever you get your podcasts. And until next time, salam.